You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The fall of Nagorno-Karabakh, a humanitarian crisis that's displaced over 100,000 Armenians, goes back generations. But the seeds of the conflict didn't start with Armenia or Azerbaijan. It all dates back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2021, we turned to journalist Simon Ostrovsky to understand how Stalin's failed legacy still imperils the region and why Russia has remained so involved.
When I was in Nagorno-Karabakh the last time, which is the last conflict that I covered, when we were staying in this hotel, and the air raid sirens would go off, and so I would sleep fully clothed in my boots and have to run down 4 flights of steps to get into the cellar of the hotel that we were in, and there were about 40 or 50 people huddled in there from around the neighborhood, many of them elderly, and many of them clearly sick with something. And you got to remember, this was like right at the peak of the pandemic, and I caught myself thinking, man, I've got to choose between an artillery strike and getting the biggest viral load of COVID imaginable in this basement after, hiding out here for several hours. I'm like, why am I putting myself through this? I don't know, maybe I'm just too old for this stuff now.
Simon Ostrovsky isn't that old yet. But after almost 2 decades covering the former Soviet Union, you can understand why he might feel tired. He's been kidnapped in Ukraine.
I'd like to just begin here with this American journalist, Simon Ostrovsky. Tell me, what are the efforts being made to free him?
Won an Emmy for his coverage of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2013. And last year, he covered the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Special correspondent Simon Ostrovsky traveled to the region again for the NewsHour.
So this is what victory looks like.
I asked him how Russia set the table for this conflict and how it continues to benefit from ongoing tensions and military flare-ups.
After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a lot of the ethnic, national, linguistic rights issues that had been frozen in time by the Soviet Union erupted quite spectacularly. And these were things that were never allowed to be talked about while the communists were in power. I'm talking about local languages and, of course, local religions, which were suppressed during the Soviet period. And so when Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Georgia for that matter, became independent countries, what happened was their borders, which were set during the Soviet period, didn't exactly match the ethnic boundaries. And so that was a ticking time bomb that had been put in place there by Stalin many, many years earlier. As soon as those countries became independent, Armenians who were left on the Azerbaijani side of the border wanted rights to self-determination. And Azerbaijanis who were living in Armenia essentially had to flee that country when war broke out between the two ethnic groups, now nation states. And that was a pattern that was repeated all across the Soviet space after the breakup of the Soviet Union. But one of the biggest and most costly wars in terms of lost life, was the Nagorno-Karabakh War, which sort of spanned the era up until 1994. Some 30,000 people were killed, maybe 500,000 to 1 million people ended up displaced. The lines of the nation states didn't matter during the Soviet period because both Armenia and Azerbaijan were part of one country. And so one village could be Azerbaijani, another village could be Armenian. There were all these ethnic groups mixed in there and cohabited when there was a power that oversaw their relations. And as soon as that power disappeared, there was also a power vacuum and people started clamoring for control. It was a lot like the situation that we had in the 1990s in the Balkans. It was similar up until the point where you start talking about ethnic cleansing, because although ethnic cleansing did happen in Armenia and Azerbaijan in the sense that the rival ethnicities had to leave the polities that they ended up in, there weren't massacres or genocides on the scale of anything that we saw in the Balkan Wars. But what you did get were these territories that were controlled by either ethnic group that were completely purified of the opposite ethnic group. So Armenia became a country where no Azerbaijanis lived, and Nagorno-Karabakh became a territory attached to Armenia where no Azerbaijanis lived. And Azerbaijan, for the most part, became a country with no Armenians, although cities like Sumgait and Baku and Ganja, before the collapse of the Soviet Union in Azerbaijan, had massive Armenian populations.
That were all pressured to move away or relocate or disappear?
Yeah, in the context of the war, it became very dangerous for Armenians to live in territory controlled by Azerbaijan. And by the same token, it became very dangerous for Azerbaijanis living in Armenian-controlled areas to remain there. And so you had families essentially over telephone and telegraph arranging exchanges of apartments, leaving everything behind where they'd lived for generations to move to a country several hundred miles away from where they grew up. And you essentially ended up with a situation where both countries were pretty much ethnically homogenous, especially in the case of Armenia. I mean, although very, very few Armenians remained in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan has several other ethnic minorities that did remain because they weren't party to the conflict. But in terms of Armenians, almost every single one had to leave. You do hear the Azerbaijani regime quoting this number of 30,000 Armenians living in peace in Azerbaijan as sort of a fig leaf, but we don't know that those figures are actually accurate, and you don't see any kind of representation of Armenian life in day-to-day Azerbaijan. I lived there for 3 years, and there's an Armenian church right in the center of Baku, the capital. And as far as I know, there's never been a church service held there. And that would be a pretty good indicator of whether there are Armenians left. And if Armenians are indeed left in Azerbaijan, then they're certainly not allowed to practice their culture and faith.
So here we are looking at a small region that's a crazy quilt, ethnically, politically, a complicated place. But adjacent are two big, rich, powerful countries, Russia and Turkey. As these little places picked sides and picked champions, who ended up with who as friends?
So it's a very, very complicated region with a lot of vying alliances. It's a lot like the Middle East, which it's right next to. I think the alliances, they're kind of defy comprehension because a lot of people would look at Azerbaijan and say, well, this is a Muslim country, and so they're probably going to be aligned with Iran, and Armenia is a Christian country, and therefore, their alliances would fit that pattern. But you look at Azerbaijan, and actually their relations with Iran are terribly fraught. And in the latest war, it emerged that one of their biggest partners in terms of military cooperation wasn't just Turkey, which really had a big hand in the last war, but actually Israel. Israel supplied to Azerbaijan tons and tons of these so-called loitering munitions, which are essentially suicide drones, which are small and cheap to manufacture, and really helped the Azerbaijanis come out on top in the latest Nagorno-Karabakh war. And in terms of Turkey, they also supplied drones to Azerbaijan and also military officers to help lead Azerbaijani troops during the war.
The drones that you were talking about, these attack drones, you've been under their watchful eye. What's that like? What can they do?
It was absolutely terrifying. I spent 10 days in Nagorno-Karabakh during the active phase of fighting on the ethnic Armenian side of the front lines.
It's really hard to describe how terrifying it is when the city is being shelled. All you can think about is, how do I get low? How do I get safe?
Even just hearing the sound of the drones circling overhead, it's like a lawnmower in the sky, is a chilling feeling. And the very first thing you do when you hear one of those things, you don't know whether it's an attack drone or an observation drone. You're just terrified, and you run and find shelter as quickly as you can.
Just as we begin our interview, we hear an attack drone circling overhead.
several countries are supplying drones to Azerbaijan, among them Turkey and Israel.
And so Azerbaijan has sort of really tied itself in with Turkey, with Israel, has emerged during the last war. But the ceasefire that actually ended up being brokered between the two countries, that was managed by Russia. And as a result of Russia's brokering of the ceasefire, it actually gained a new foothold in the region. Some 2,000 Russian peacekeepers are now patrolling the areas of Nagorno-Karabakh that remain under ethnic Armenian control. Azerbaijan won a considerable chunk of territory, but they didn't take everything. And in the bits where Azerbaijanis still don't have control in Nagorno-Karabakh, that's where the Russians are. And the Russians obviously have a recent historical relationship with both countries as the imperial power that used to run both of them. And so they also have relationships and common languages with both the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, where Russian is still widely known, if not spoken. And Putin used his position of influence in both countries in order to impose this ceasefire agreement. I won't call it a peace settlement because it's still a tinderbox that could blow up at any time. But if we're looking for a sort of geostrategic power that won out in this conflict in 2020, it was probably the Russians that gained the most advantage there, because no matter what decisions have to be made between Azerbaijan and Armenia in the future, Russia is always going to play a role there in brokering those decisions. Another thing that's important to remember is that this represents the first time since the end of the Soviet Union that Russia has had troops in all three former Soviet republics of the South Caucasus region. I mean, in the 2008 war that we saw in Georgia, Russia ended up occupying about a quarter of that country's territory and bringing its troops to Georgia. Russia has a long-standing agreement with Armenia and has had a military base there for a long time, and they're actually in a sort of military alliance that kind of tries to mirror the NATO alliance. And so Russia has had troops in Armenia for quite some time. But the one place that it didn't have troops in was Azerbaijan. Now with these peacekeepers, that's actually changed. But the interesting thing is Turkey has also sort of emerged in a nascent stage as a major power player in the Caucasus. I mean, not major at this time right now because they have around 70 so-called military monitors stationed in Azerbaijan. They fly drones around the region, and ostensibly they're there to monitor that the ceasefire agreement is being held in place so that it's not just the Russians who are viewed as aligned with Armenia monitoring the situation. So that's a first for Turkey as well, you know, a country that's a part of NATO but has not had any influence for over a century in the South Caucasus. So these might be baby steps for Turkey, but the way the Turks want to present it is this is the beginning of a long road where they're going to link Azerbaijan to the Turkic world and to the other Turkic countries of Central Asia.
What role does oil play in all of this?
The Caucasus are essentially an energy corridor between the Caspian Sea, Central Asia, and Europe. There is the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which was the first major oil infrastructure project that channels oil from the Caspian Sea to Turkey, and then from Turkey can go to the rest of the world. This was built with American backing for the reason that Americans and Westerners generally felt that countries of the former Soviet Union should have independent export routes for their oil and gas that avoided Russia, so that it would be easier for them to get out from under Russia's thumb. What we've seen happen in the years since then is that Russia has tried to resist newer infrastructure projects that would continue to take these countries out of its sphere of influence. And the fact that Russia brokered the ceasefire in Nagorno-Karabakh has actually made it possible for Russia to write itself into the agreement in the sense that part of the agreement is for a transport corridor that will cross Armenia from Azerbaijan, and this road would bisect Armenia, allow Azerbaijani goods and Turkish goods to go in both directions through Armenian territory. There's a provision there that says that Russia is supposed to provide security for this transport corridor. So that puts Russia right at the center of anything that's going to happen in the Caucasus in the future.
In the Yeltsin years, before his departure from the scene and the strongman arrival of Putin, the United States in particular, the West in general, was putting out feelers in that part of the world, cultivating and courting new political elements in places like Ukraine, in the three Baltic countries, and in Georgia and Armenia. I mean, the presidents of those young republics visited Washington pretty routinely in the 1990s and the early 00s. And then it seems like America lost its juice in that part of the world. What happened?
I think, America's pullback from international affairs is about much more than just the Caucasus region. And I think it started during the Obama era when Americans were getting so sick and tired of the adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan that had been embarked upon during the Bush administration. And so I think, with Obama winning the election in large part due to Americans' fatigue with international affairs and international wars, this pullback from anything that was viewed as messy began and continued into the Trump era, where essentially this became a region that the American administration just didn't want to be involved in whatsoever. We were thinking about other things at the end of last year. We had the election here to contend with, the coronavirus pandemic. So this became an opportunity for Russia. Russia had free hand, essentially, without interference from any other powers, to step in and to become the architect of a deal that ended up benefiting it. And the United States was nowhere to be found.
What impact will that have on the formation of democratic institutions, stable longitudinal governance in a whole array of countries across Central Asia? I mean, if you're a Kazakh democratic activist, if you're an Uzbek free speech advocate, if you're in Belarus and wondering whether you're going to get any help from outside to extricate yourself from Lukashenko land, what is this lack of interest in the United States, what does it mean for the prospects in the coming years?
I think authoritarianism is definitely on the march in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union. And America's relative pullback from the region and from international affairs more generally is going to mean that, the State Department and the White House, they might pay lip service to democratic principles and to opposition politicians in these various regions, but they're not going to be there for them when they need them the most. And we've already seen the Biden administration distancing itself, even in a place as fraught and as critical as Ukraine, where he was the special envoy for so many years under the Obama administration. And so I think that a lot of human rights activists and opposition politicians and civil society members living in that part of the world and trying to improve their countries are starting to realize that they're on their own and they have to start making alliances with new people, new powers, or simply just to rely on themselves. Or the sadder alternative here is give up the fight completely. And, we've seen rollbacks happen in Belarus, which was a country that was authoritarian before the pandemic, but I think now can be described as totalitarian. And Central Asia is not heading in a democratic direction either. So I think that we're in a period of history where a lot of countries are more inwardly focused, and a lot of countries that weren't, such as Russia, are now trying to expand their influence. I think Russia seeks influence for its own sake, and Putin in particular is hell-bent on restoring as much of the power of the Soviet Union as existed when he was born and raised.
Well, Simon Ostrovsky, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you so much, Ray.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. When we come back, we turn to independent Azeri journalist Arzu Geybulla. She spoke with our former co-host, Teresa Katsourillas, just after the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Imagine growing up in the early days of post-Soviet freedom, but still living under an authoritarian government. A generation has come of age in the internet era of free-flowing information, but their communities, media, and national politics are still constrained by ancient stereotypes and ethnic and religious divisions.
A government official makes a statement against Armenia, for instance. No one questions it. Everyone's kind of like, yeah, go. Yeah, we support you. Yeah, we need to show them who the boss is.
For Arzu Geybulla, building bridges of understanding has become part of her life's work.
I am originally from Azerbaijan. I've been based in Turkey since 2010. I'm a journalist. I cover Azerbaijan predominantly, but I also focus on the region. And when I say region, I mean I write on Georgia, I write on Armenia, and sometimes on Turkey.
Arzu also started a website focused on internet freedom and authoritarian technology. More than a decade ago, Arzu helped direct a program at the Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation. They brought Azerbaijanis and Armenians together in the same room to talk face-to-face.
The idea was to discuss the history of the conflict, discuss the history of the relations between the two countries, and then once these aspects were covered, to talk about what can people like them do to keep the dialogue going, to keep their relationship going, and to show that, the two communities can coexist together. And it was really interesting to see how Azerbaijani and Armenian participants would discuss history. They would come up with a timeline, because basically the first day of the dialogue is the assignment given to them is to come up with 10 or 11 important historical dates that they think had an impact on the history of the conflict and of the relations. And so they would come up with these dates, and then we would facilitate that discussion. And then we would bring the timeline together and list it in chronological order and have the groups explain why that specific date or event made it to the list. And the whole point of that conversation was to make sure that people understand where they're coming from. Not necessarily agree, because that was kind of like one of the things that we would stick on the floor when this was discussed was understanding doesn't equal agreeing. Like, we're not, trying to convince anyone in anything. We're just trying to make sure that there is some kind of conversation going. And so we kept working with these groups, and then we decided that maybe we should expand and not just work with students, but also bring in sort of larger civil society representatives. So we started working with people from the NGOs. And then eventually my last dialogue that I facilitated was with journalists from Armenia and Azerbaijan, because we wanted to focus on conflict-sensitive journalism and conflict-sensitive reporting, presenting the conflict using the language that's not aggressive, that's not violent. You present the facts of both sides. And instead of triggering and instead of instilling more hatred or negative emotions, you simply cover what's happening. So just to give an example, like during the war, September 27 is when the war started, and it lasted for 44 days. So every day, there were reports of people getting killed, civilians, military, bombing of civilian areas.
Tit-for-tat shelling today in the Karabakh city of
27 people were killed in fighting on Monday, bringing its total number of casualties to 58.
Now, this comes at the back of 4 other people who died on Tuesday evening, including an infant.
21 civilians and wounding dozens more in strikes close to the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh.
When you report on bombing of civilian areas, for instance, right, the objective is to report on all casualties. You don't just report on what the enemy has done to you. You also report on what you've instilled on the enemy, quote unquote. And what I was seeing more often was counting one side's losses, as if, you dehumanize the other side. And conflict-sensitive journalism is the opposite. You have to humanize it, and you have to make sure that you give credit and you talk about both sides of the conflict.
For Arzu, last year's war between Azerbaijan and Armenia was heartbreaking on so many levels.
I mean, the war itself was devastating for both sides, obviously, but as a journalist, I saw how little of conflict-sensitive journalism actually exists in both countries. And as an Azerbaijani, I was looking at my colleagues who were covering the war and how much of the government narrative, especially what the Ministry of Defense was posting or, the statements that were coming in from the government, how much of that narrative would make into the stories. The media outlets, even the ones that we consider independent or opposition, they would take the titles from the statements that were coming in from the Ministry of Defense and just put them on top of the story. And then we'll be like, we destroyed this many enemies today, or like this many people were killed as a result of successful operation carried out by our army. This kind of language that isn't something that you should be seeing when you're covering war as a journalist. So it was a really difficult time to try to be an independent journalist covering a war that you've basically grew up with. I was born in 1983, so my whole kind of young and adult life, I have been hearing about the war. I have friends who are internally displaced people who are my age now who talked about the war. Or I grew up on stories of my parents who had neighbors from Armenia prior to war. And being on the side of independent journalism, trying to look at it from an independent perspective was really hard. And it was also very easy to become a target.
Then the conversation moved to the topic of whether Turkey was sending foreign fighters to assist Azerbaijani troops.
And this was very profusely rejected by both the Turkish government and Azerbaijani government.
Arzu didn't comment on whether media reports about this were true, but she did say,
the fact that this is being reported by so many outlets is not a good sign for Azerbaijan's image, because the country has always boasted about its military strength. And so people started attacking me for that. They started posting some crappy stuff about me, about my family. Social media went crazy. I had to deactivate my Facebook. I had to deactivate my Instagram account. I locked my Twitter account, which I've never done. Like in 11 years of my journalism career, I've never done it. Online harassment, it was online sexual harassment. There were threats, there were death threats, and it was just a difficult time, I guess.
Arzu's back on social media now, and she says she still believes reconciliation is possible. But it's a hard sell in an atmosphere ripe with censorship and disinformation.
I mean, the historical narratives that we are brought up on are very much one-sided. And it really helps to feed this misinformation machine, propaganda machine that only builds more hate, more mistrust, more acceptance of the other as an enemy rather than as someone who may not want war, may want peace. We need to look into the history to analyze and be open to even sharing what the other side has or has written or has said, because it's a grievance. You are addressing something that's been sitting there for centuries, in one instance, decades in another, and you really need to address it. You can't proceed without addressing the elephant in the room. And so I think one of the ways to move forward in the context of now post-war Armenia and Azerbaijan is for both sides, if they're really talking about dialogue and they're talking about coexistence, then history narrative is one of the pillars of moving forward, especially if we want to avoid propaganda coming and biting us once again.
That was Arzu Geybulla. She's an Azerbaijani journalist based in Istanbul and the founder of Azerbaijan Internet Watch.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Teresa Katsourillis, Joanne Jennings, and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.